Portugal will continue to express its solidarity with Macau, will remain committed to its future in the conviction that here too, democracy and freedom are an irreplaceable reality, pledge of peace and progress for all peoples.
On December 20th, 1999, this 25 square kilometer Portuguese colony on China's southern coast, known as Macau, was returned to China, becoming the Macau Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China. As the Portuguese flag descended minutes before midnight, after 400 years, Europe's first and last colony in Asia officially ended, along with the Portuguese Empire. Seconds later, the ascent of the Chinese national flag marked the beginning of a new era for China, just 11 days before the turn of the millennium. The timing could have hardly been more symbolic, as many scholars and experts proclaim the new century China's. But what, exactly, China had in mind for this tiny, crime-infested enclave, no one knew for sure. In the 20 years since the handover, Macau has transformed into the gambling capital of the world. While some call it the Las Vegas of the East, a more apt description would be of Las Vegas as the mini Macau of the West. In 2018, Macau reported over 6 times more revenue than Vegas, $37 billion to 6. With 5 of the world's 10 largest casinos, Macau is bigger, more extravagant, and sometimes even tackier than its American counterpart. In all other ways, however, Macau resembles its neighbor and older half-sister, Hong Kong. The similarities are striking, beginning but not ending with their geography. Both border mainland China on one side and the South China Sea on the other, forming the edges of the Pearl River Delta. Getting to and from one another is quite easy. A 1-hour ferry ride with departures every 20 minutes, a half-hour bus or car ride across the longest sea crossing in the world, or, for the lavish, a direct helicopter. Because of this, it's not uncommon for Hong Kongers to visit Macau in a single day, or vice versa. Most shops and restaurants in Macau accept and give change in Hong Kong dollars, although the official currency is the Macanese Bataka. One difference is their relative size. While Hong Kong measures 1,100 square kilometers or 427 square miles, Macau is just 28 and 10 respectively, making it physically smaller than all but 4 sovereign states, Tuvalu, Nauru, Monaco, and the Vatican City. It's just slightly smaller than Manhattan and about 1/6 the size of Washington, D.C. Just large enough to have small distinct neighborhoods and justify owning a personal car, but not so big you could ever really get lost, especially with the tall, conspicuous casinos dominating the skyline. Physically, Macau is split in 2. To the north is the more historic Macau Peninsula. Here you'll find the Macau Tower, home of the 233-meter, 764-foot highest commercial bungee jump in the world, the ancient Ah Ma Temple, picturesque ruins of St. Paul's, Senado Square, and Colonial Fort. On the other side, connected by 3 bridges, is the airport, Panda Park, candidate for coolest looking Apple Store, and the majority of Macau's newest and largest casinos. Linguistically, Macau is, frankly, a mess. As of the last census, 80% of the population speaks Cantonese, the variety of Chinese popular in South China, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Although, because of the high number of mainland visitors, most service staff can also speak Mandarin. Macau's second of 3 official languages, Portuguese, can be seen everywhere, on signs, as names, and on police cars, but heard almost nowhere, spoken by just 0.6% of households. But because it's used in the legal code, law students at the University of Macau study in Portuguese. A once popular blend of Cantonese and Portuguese called Patois has now been reduced to around 50 speakers. Finally, English is generally understood at a basic level, and is usually the 3rd language on signs. A misunderstanding between its 2 official languages is also the source of a strange, unsolved controversy, the spelling of its name. Banknotes spell Macau with a U, while its passports use an O. Google Maps uses the former, and Apple the latter. The government has yet to take an uncontradicted official stance, leaving every country to decide for itself. Even today, long after their respective transfers back to China, Hong Kong and Macau have retained much of their former colonizers' culture. Double-decker buses, English street names, and afternoon tea survive in Hong Kong, while bright Portuguese village architecture dominates Macau. Finally, both territories receive the same unique status as neither independent countries nor dependent cities under the one country, two systems framework, and just 2 years apart. In almost every way you can imagine, linguistically, geographically, politically, historically, Macau and Hong Kong are identical twins. At least, they should be. Which is why it was puzzling when, in December 2019, Chinese President Xi Jinping flew to Macau to celebrate the 20th anniversary of its handover. Macau honored its motherland with fireworks, photos, and celebratory dinners, while Hong Kong, just across the bay, fiercely protested in millions against China. So how did the two special administrative regions, both former colonies of European powers, return to China just 2 years apart, both small and only 40 miles from each other, become so drastically different? While tiny Macau is overshadowed by its larger, more economically important neighbor, politically, it's far more important to China. The story of Macau is not merely unique and fascinating as a city, a fusion of Portuguese and Chinese culture, Las Vegas on steroids, a distinct political entity with only 28 square kilometers, the country or territory with the highest population density in the world, but also for its overlooked global political importance. During the 15th century, the Chinese Navy was, by far, the world's most advanced and powerful. Its 3,500 ships were up to 120 meters or 400 feet long, with 12 sails, luxurious staterooms, and crews as large as 1,500 people. Today, for comparison, the US Navy maintains a fleet of just over 400 ships, and Christopher Columbus's largest ship measured just 19 meters long. Chinese explorers reached the Cape of Good Hope 2 centuries before the Portuguese claimed to discover it. Had it wanted to, China could have become the colonizer, not the colonized, and returned territory to Europe in 1999, not the other way around. And yet, it made the drastic decision to burn most of its own fleet, and their maps, which would have allowed for future expeditions. Possibly worried about the rising costs of exploration, internal politics, and outside influences corroding superior Chinese culture, China decided to let others come to it. Europe, on the other hand, was unfazed by this cultural comparison, wanting only to become rich through trade. Portugal arrived in India in 1498 and violently took over Malacca by 1511. It was in this environment, mired in skepticism, distrust, and mutual dislike, that the Portuguese explorer Jorge Alvarez reached China's southern coast in 1513. Knowing their reputation, the Portuguese advanced cautiously into China, first sending only 2 ships to Canton, now called Guangzhou. In 1516, Portugal sent 9 more, slowly building trust over time. 2 years later, however, a new, more ambitious explorer arrived and set up a small colony on an island near present-day Macau. On it, he built a fort, which he argued was necessary to protect his fleet from pirates. He was also accused of kidnapping Chinese children for prostitution. The Chinese, already hesitant, were outraged. Chinese officials ordered the evacuation of all foreigners from its lands, taking some Europeans hostage. Portugal, distracted elsewhere, never returned with any significant military presence, seemingly closing the door to trade with China. Individual merchants, however, still dreaming of gold, persisted on their own. A small group of sailors returned, this time with a plan. As their boats approached the southern Chinese coast, they told officials they came bearing tributes, but first they needed to be set up to dry on land. The Chinese, flattered, agreed to let them build structures for that purpose on present-day Macau. Before the Chinese could realize there was no tribute, they were offered 500 ounces of silver and custom duties in exchange for a lease of the land. Soon, bribes were also paid to allow trade on 2 other nearby islands. One grew to a population of 500. In 1557, the Portuguese attacked and scared away a band of nearby pirates, pleasing the Chinese emperor. One account claims he then gave official permission for the Portuguese to stay on Macau. Another, that of the Colonial Office of Lisbon, argues that because the land was effectively controlled by pirates and not China, by conquering them, Portugal won the right to the land under the principle that sovereignty is founded on the right of conquest. Whatever the truth, from then on, Portugal was confident sending resources to Macau, making it a permanent settlement. Still, China had the upper hand, and the Portuguese went out of their way to please the Chinese lords. The annual bribe became an official rent, which, even more important than the income it provided, was a tacit admission of China's sovereignty. A wall was constructed between Macau and the mainland. The gate, called the Porta de Cerso, was surrounded by Chinese troops, and in case there was any confusion, read, "Honor your motherland, for your motherland looks over you." China worried that Macau might try taking more of its land, or spread Catholicism across the border. Macanese were forbidden from staying overnight in Guangzhou, as were Chinese in Macau. No new housing was allowed to be built on Macau without Chinese approval, and unmarried European merchants were to remain on their ships for the duration of their visit. After seeing the now famous St. Paul's Church under construction, Chinese officials mistook it as a secret fort, and in response planned an invasion. Only after visiting Macau and seeing the churches did they call off the attack. The next era was defined by Britain's growing presence in the region. At one point, annoyed by the British, the Chinese offered Macau a monopoly on tea exports. This was its golden, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and would have shifted the economic center of the region away from Hong Kong. The governor of Macau, however, fearing British religious influence, refused, forever deciding its fate. Soon unable to compete with Hong Kong in trade, Macau turned to less savory sources of income, processing opium, legalizing prostitution, and, most significantly, officially opening the door to gambling. At the end of the 18th century, trade had virtually ended in Macau, while Britain's tea and opium trade exploded, eventually ending in the First Opium War and Hong Kong being leased to Britain. Emboldened by what happened across the bay, Macau gained the confidence to stop paying rent to China, complicating their relationship. Chinese laws were removed from government offices, and in 1849, the governor was assassinated. Seizing the opportunity, Chinese troops were sent to reclaim the territory. Unexpectedly, Portugal successfully defended its colony with the help of British, French, and Spanish forces. At this point, it was clear to both sides that something had to be decided. Finally, in 1887, a treaty was signed. For the first time ever, China recognized Portuguese, quote, occupation and government over Macau, in exchange for cooperation in managing the trade of opium. This diplomatic progress, however, was lost in 1949 with the formation of the People's Republic of China, which Portugal refused to recognize. In this new political environment, Portugal paid closer attention to Macau, classifying it as an overseas province and managing its finances from afar. It was becoming clear that Portugal had an interest in Macau and had no intention of ceding control to China, which it still didn't even acknowledge the existence of. Then, something 10,000 kilometers away would change everything. In the early 1970s, Portugal was in a bad place. Politically, it had transformed into a fascist and effectively single-party state. Economically, it was spread thin, spending nearly half of its national budget fighting in Africa. Then, in 1974, a popular uprising overthrew the authoritarian government and eventually led to democratic reform. Remarkably, all this without the use of violence. For faraway China, this was an unexpected dream come true. Portugal was all of a sudden eager to end its empire, and fast. While Britain could slowly unwind its colonies over time and thus hold leverage over them, Portugal's cards were already on the table, making it a terrible poker player. In negotiations, China always had the upper hand, knowing that Portugal was committed to decolonization. First, Macau was reclassified from overseas province to Chinese territory under Portuguese administration. In 1979, the new leftist government in Portugal recognized the PRC and secretly signed an agreement which A. recognized Chinese sovereignty over Macau, B. set expectations for a future return of Macau to China, and C. gave China the choice of when to hold negotiations. China had Macau removed from the UN Special Committee on Decolonization list of colonies, preferring to deal with Portugal directly rather than risk the international community pushing for Macau's independence, like other former colonies. At this point, it was clear China would accept nothing less than a full handover, and Portugal, uncoordinated and having surrendered nearly all its leverage, was ready to oblige. Now, the only question was when. Portugal offered 1985, but China was in no hurry and turned it down, preferring to first focus on securing Hong Kong before turning to easier Macau. Still, Portugal was successful on two fronts. First, after China requested a 1997 handover to coincide with Hong Kong's, Portugal pushed back, preferring 2004 or 7. Finally, in 1987, a compromise was struck for 99. Secondly, in the end, China promised to acknowledge Portuguese passports carried by Macau residents, although it would only refer to them as travel documents. Then, on December 20th, 1999, after 4 centuries of uncertainty, Chinese troops entered the city and a new era of economic prosperity began. While gambling had been popular in Macau ever since Hong Kong began dominating trade, it was limited to a single government-approved monopoly. Because casinos were legally classified as a public service, potential operators bid for the chance to run all of them. In 1961, a company called STDM, run by Stanley Ho, won the monopoly and built some of its most iconic early casinos, including the Lisboa. Although its contract was set to expire in the 80s, Portugal declined to make any significant changes to Macau's economy in the uncertain lead-up to the handover. For this reason, the STDM monopoly was renewed and lasted just over 40 years, making Stanley Ho and his associates fabulously rich. In 2002, with its new contract expired, the handover complete, and public outrage at STDM for its immense control over the economy and cause of widespread crime, a new bid was made for 3 new concessions. Seeing the riches made in the last 4 decades, American companies rushed to compete. The winners were Wynn Resorts, a joint entry by Galaxy Entertainment and Las Vegas Sands, and Stanley Ho's new company, SJM. The SARS outbreak in 2002 and 3 slowed the region's economic growth, but casino companies saw low property prices as an opportunity, snatching up as much of Macau as possible. 11 total casinos in 2002 became 35 far bigger casino resorts by 2014. The newly opened Sands Macau, its first operated by a foreign company, soon became the most profitable casino on Earth, making back its initial investment in the first 10 months of operation. To put this economic explosion in perspective, this was Macau's gaming revenue in 2002, compared to Las Vegas and Atlantic City. And here they are 10 years later. No city or region in the world even remotely approaches Macau, despite being a relatively small player on the global scale just 2 decades ago. And this is certainly reflected in Macau's extravagance. The Wynn features a dancing fountain, giant dragon show, and takes up 6 full blocks of city. The Grand Lisboa, Stanley Ho's revenge after foreign companies entered the market, is the tallest building in the territory. Both beautiful and also unnerving in its domination of the tiny skyline. Studio City, meanwhile, is a $3.2 billion Hollywood theme park resort with the world's first figure-8 Ferris wheel carved out of the structure. Finally, in the mid-2000s, the water between its 2 southern islands was filled, turning them into a single stretch of land and making way for the grandest casino of them all, the Venetian Macau. While previous casinos were built infused with Portuguese and local flair, the Cotai Strip, as it's called, is modeled after Vegas. It's built around cars, impossibly huge buildings, and Versailles levels of opulence. Casinos are surrounded by, well, more casinos and roads. Shops and restaurants are located inside them, rarely between them, leaving little reason to ever step foot outside. The Venetian is the world's 7th largest building, and the largest casino in the world, with 878 tables and 3,300 slot machines, 3 times the biggest in Vegas. It features an indoor mock village shopping mall with a canal and gondolas, 15,000-seat auditorium, 1.2 million square foot convention space, dental clinic, and university. All of this growth is thanks to one thing: China. On the mainland, there are only 2 forms of legal gambling: the China welfare and sports lotteries. And in 2003, China lifted visa restrictions, allowing residents of all major cities to individually visit Macau without permission from the government. In other words, tiny Macau has been blessed as the only place where just under 20% of the entire world's population can legally gamble on Chinese sovereign territory, giving it a never-ending flow of tourists from the world's largest growing middle class. Although these large numbers distract from Macau's true source of revenue. While it may look like a larger Las Vegas on the surface, its business model is actually quite different. At the Venetian Las Vegas, for example, 36% of revenue comes from rooms, 15% from food or beverages, and only 23% from the casino. The Venetian Macau, on the other hand, makes 80% from the casino, just 2.5% from rooms, and 6% from food and beverages. While 99% of visitors to Vegas stay overnight, only half do in Macau. Las Vegas has diversified as a city of entertainment, full of world-renowned kitchens, theaters, bars, and shows. Macau bans drinking in casinos and allows smoking only in a small number of lounges. The vast majority of its revenue comes not from a large number of partygoers, but a select few extremely rich VIPs. As of 2014, about 40% of Macau's gaming revenue comes from mass-market games, and 60% from a very small number of private VIP baccarat rooms. The challenge for casinos is that while Hong Kong allows for the legal collection of gambling debts, mainland China does not, making most of its visitors very high financial risks. Casinos, therefore, hire junkets, companies who, in exchange for either a commission on chips or a percent of the net rolling bet, go to China, attract high net worth customers with gifts, and then deliver them to Macau on private jets. When they arrive, junkets bring them to special VIP rooms with different chips and higher taxes. The other challenge is that China only allows its residents to leave with a maximum of 20,000 RMB, or about $3,000 US, hardly enough to get special attention. To circumvent these restrictions, pawn shops will sell expensive watches or jewelry to VIPs using a credit card, who will then immediately return the item in exchange for the local bahtaka or Hong Kong dollar. Another method is for junkets to issue credit directly to their clients, assuming the risk so casinos don't have to. Predictably, these tricks have been used by many in China to smuggle money outside the mainland. As casinos have grown to represent 86% of all tax revenue for the territory, they've become less a source of income and more the economy in its entirety. More than just buildings, casinos have become a way of life. Locals use their free shuttle buses to get around the territory, eat at their restaurant, and from them make their living. Because casino jobs don't require a diploma of any kind, high schools and universities compete with them. The economically less fortunate are stuck in small, cramped apartments and forced to commute across the border to the mainland city of Zhuhai for reasonably priced groceries. Casinos menacingly tower above everyday life, announcing their importance to the local economy, and also, inadvertently, the severity of collapse should one ever occur. A recent decline in visitors as a result of the US-China trade war, virus, and protests across the Bay has made clear the need for diversification. Simply put, a Macau without profitable casinos would not merely struggle, but collapse. For locals, everything is at stake. For China, there's something even bigger on its mind. Since June 2019, when protests erupted in Hong Kong, authorities have feared the same in Macau. As if containing a virus, its borders have been carefully scrutinized, both by Macau and mainland police, who have jurisdiction over the artificial island, which, as part of the bridge, connects Hong Kong to Macau. In December, several American business leaders on their way to a corporate event were detained and denied entry without a reason given. And yet, in the over 7 months since the nearby unrest began, nothing has happened. The closest thing Macau has seen to protests occurred in August, when online forums began organizing a demonstration for its most heavily trafficked plaza. After much anticipation, the time came, police waited, a few suspicious onlookers were searched and questioned, and the day passed like almost any other. If Hong Kong and Macau are an experiment, the observed differences are obvious. A deep, widespread, urgent desire for change and democracy in one, and relative contentment in the other. What, then, is the independent variable, the cause, the thing that would, despite their similarities, create such divergent personalities? The huge, glaring, flashing answer is money. Macau's $122,000 per capita GDP is the second highest of any country or territory, after Qatar, and more than double that of Hong Kong. Its government collects so much revenue, in fact, that it redistributes checks to all its residents, both permanent and not. In 2019, for example, holders of permanent ID cards were given 10,000 MOP, and non-permanent 6,000, equivalent to around 1,200 and 700 USD, respectively. This hypothesis is certainly true, to an extent. Macau knows that its economy is almost single-handedly built by mainland tourists, and it would thus be financially unwise to bite the hand which feeds it. This, however, is also true of Hong Kong. But there, mainlanders are mocked as they drag oversized luggage around its malls, not thanked for their significant economic contribution. China chooses to believe the economic explanation because, frankly, it's useful. While China is largely insulated from the rest of the world through censorship, the Hong Kong protests are right on its doorstep, impossible to hide. It can't deny the protests, so it must present an explanation for their existence to the domestic audience, one that doesn't spread them. It also can't acknowledge a legitimate desire for democracy, so it argues the root of the protests is not political, but economic, a much easier pill to swallow. It's easier for China to believe Hong Kongers only want riches, not democracy, when that is how it thinks. If Hong Kong is only unhappy because of its tiny apartments, inequality, and rising prices, the solution is simple: economic reform. In reality, it's nowhere near that simple. Clearly, there are several factors responsible. First, Macau's small size just makes it far easier to control. Before the handover, Beijing sent a small team of its own experts to Portugal to learn the language and culture, who it then installed in Macau's new government. By managing its political composition from the very beginning, China guaranteed its loyalty for decades to come. All three of Macau's chief executives, its equivalent to president, have been pro-Beijing. Even more so than his predecessor, who was made fun of for his poor Mandarin skills, the newly elected chief, in fact, has a close personal history in China, where he served on the National People's Congress. Notably, the first two heads of government both served their maximum 2 terms of 5 years each, whereas no Hong Kong chief executive has ever managed to stay in power for 10 years, and the current leader is far from reversing that trend. Partially as a result of this, Macau, unlike its neighbor, has a deeply entrenched, legally codified allegiance to the motherland. Schools, for instance, teach with the same textbooks as the mainland, and its 2009 National Security Bill punishes acts of, quote, treason, secession, and subversion against the Chinese government, with up to 25 years in prison. Another difference is Hong Kong and Macau's metaphorical fathers. Ideologically, Britain left a more profound legacy in Hong Kong than Portugal in Macau. While there are many reminders of Portugal in its architecture, names, and monuments, like the small friendship statue by St. Paul's Church, they're no more meaningful than the model Eiffel Tower at the Parisian Macau Hotel, merely visual, not political. Collectively, all these factors over decades have produced profound differences in an area no number or headline can quite capture: identity. While Hong Kong has very much developed its own distinct and beautiful identity, Macau, in its petiteness, has largely adopted that of its mother. From this largely unspoken difference of mentality, very different thought processes emerge. When China attempts to integrate itself further into the regions, Macau sees only another economic opportunity, while Hong Kong sees its very identity being systematically attacked. Macau wonders why anyone would refuse riches, and concludes that the protests must be fueled by teenage foolishness. Hong Kongers, meanwhile, wonder how anyone could trade something so intimate as your own identity for something as vain as a nicer car or apartment. What China refuses to understand is that Hong Kong will never be like Macau, because it doesn't want to be. Still, one question remains unanswered. Why does China care? For it, Macau's entire economy is not even a rounding error. It's useful as a source of tourism, sure, but it serves a far greater role in China's narrative. Macau's real purpose is symbolic. As an argument, it represents another path for Taiwan, in contrast to Hong Kong. Fight for democracy and pay for it, like Hong Kong, or embrace China and become rich, like Macau. It's proof China thinks that the one country, two systems framework can be successful, and that reunification with Taiwan is mutually beneficial. Macau is a fascinating, one-of-a-kind place, but make no mistake, proof it is not. In practice, Macau feels more like a special economic zone in China, like Shenzhen or Shanghai, than a unique culture and identity like Hong Kong. The only thing China's golden child proves is that when you abandon democracy, teach propaganda, and are handed a monopoly, yes, you can become fabulously rich.